Okay, right. So apologies for the technical glitch there. Never mind. We're up and running now. So what I thought I would do with this, well, actually, first of all, let's just quickly say, Jason, where are you? Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Pensacola, Florida,
Very cool.
United States.
Yeah, we have people in the United States. I think we have somebody in Germany where it's getting pretty late now who wants to watch this evening. Marco, how about you? Where are you? Go on.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Hi, guys. I'm from Romania, actually.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very good English.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been living for 4 years in the UK, so I guess
Okay,
that's coming from.
that helps. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Daniel, I don't know whether I don't think you've got audio and video. You have a mic symbol. Can you unmute and tell us where you're at? One moment, says Daniel. Croatia. Excellent. So we're truly international this evening. Fantastic. Okay, well, if I click this, hopefully that will go back and you can all see me. I apologise that I'm not more handsome, but there we go. So what I'm going to do is work through the questions that people submitted for the podcast. You guys who are in on the call can ask questions. I'd like to ask you a favour, which is if you can keep an eye on the chat for the event, and if people ask questions there, and a little bit later on, maybe I'll ask you guys if there are any questions. Maybe you could pass those on to me. I can check them here as well, but I have about 5 windows open, so it gets pretty confusing. So I had a question from Don, but he said he was going to try and stop in, and I don't see him here yet, so I will leave that for the time being. And Daniel, I have a question here about mastering tracks loud. Is the Daniel who's on the call the Daniel who asked the question? He's not answering. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. He's still trying to find his mic. That's fair enough. Okay, so I'm going to answer. Well, okay, maybe you are the right Daniel, so I will save that question and I will. Okay, Tony, I know is watching. I sent him an invite, but I don't think he's in the Hangout. So the first question then is, he says, in the obvious video, use the multiband compressor to help control the bass of the track. Can you tell me why you use attack and release times of 100 milliseconds for both? The answer to that is that what I find is I don't like the sound of very fast attack and release times in compression in mastering. I find it tends to take away the transient impact. It very quickly sounds kind of thick, and I lose all the punch and the dynamics that I'm trying to retain. Of course, if you use longer attack times, then the transients get through, and that means you're going to have clipping, but that's why we have the limiter at the end of the chain. So basically you can use slow attack and release times with the compressor, catch the peaks with the limiter, which will then be very transparent, and that's what I find gives the best results. There's no particular reason for those value. Well, actually, the true reason is those were the longest attack and release times that the TC Electronic System 6000 that I used all those years at Sound Recording Technology, SRT. That was the longest you could go with the attack and release times in the software at that point. And at one point I was scaling them, so I had 100 milliseconds in the bass, 75 milliseconds in the mid-range, and 50 milliseconds in the high end. And just over time, tweaking all of those things, I ended up just making them as long as I could. I mean, you've probably noticed by now in the course that I tend to use the compression, well, everything pretty conservatively, but especially the compression. And what that means is that I think the attack and release times are less crucial, especially because you have a limiter in there clamping down on the really fast stuff. I do tweak attack and release times, but I do it a lot less than some people might expect. And I've spoken to some people who are kind of quite upset by that concept and feel that I should be paying more attention to the attack and release times, and especially in individual bands, for example. I'm not saying those guys are wrong, but you know that I'm very careful to compare the before and after, and these days I use perception to do that. I don't generally hear problems with those attack and release times. So examples of when I might change it is if I have something that's particularly spiky and I want to get in there earlier and hold back the transient of the note. It's unusual that I would go longer. So sometimes I pull those back just to kind of get extra control of something that's really, really spiky. And quite often that's a kind of side effect of an attacker with a compressor with a slow attack time in the first place. But yeah, they're values that I settled on a long time ago, and I don't feel the need to adjust them that much. I mean, you've probably noticed from the techniques I'm using in the videos, in general, I don't agonize too much about the individual parameter settings of the multiband compression, if that's what I'm using, because, you know, rather than constantly adjusting the threshold, for example, what I'm doing is adjusting the EQ balance of everything going in, and that effectively adjusts the threshold. You know, if you boost the 100 hertz by 6 dBs, it's a bit like reducing the threshold of the low band by 6 dBs, right? You're effectively making the overall system 6 dBs more sensitive. But with EQ, you have far more precise control. You know, in a multiband, it probably goes from 0 up to 160, 200 hertz, the low frequency band. And typically you don't have very fine control over the crossovers. So rather than spend all my time agonizing over the parameters in the compressor, I'm just constantly tweaking the EQ. Sure, you can ask somebody. Is that Jason asking if you can add a question? Yeah, you guys feel free at any point to unmute yourselves and chip in. You know, if something I'm saying is not clear or it prompts you, that's the idea of doing it live. So yeah, don't feel you need to ask permission. Just so what was the follow on?
Okay, it basically goes along with this same concept.
That could be.
Can you hear me now, or does it sound crazy?
Hang on, sorry, I have a dodgy connection. Okay, I'm going to swap my headphones. Bear with me. Okay, try that again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry about that.
All right. So basically, with this question, you're adding 100 milliseconds release and attack time. So I'm using, when you first showed this trick, you used the Melda Productions multiband compressor. The second time you showed it, you used the Wave C4 compressor. So I'm using the Wave C4 compressor. So I guess pretty much for anyone that's using that one. What I'm not sure about when I use it is if I set it to 100 milliseconds on attack and release, and I pull the threshold down to 16 on every single channel, are you boosting the gain or the output on that channel at all? Or is this solely putting its own color just with these particular settings?
That's a good question, and I don't use the waves much, so I don't know for certain.
Because, I mean, I see it doing some type of gain reduction. Like, I see the line moving, and we're only talking maybe 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction when it's moving. So I didn't know if you were looking at getting more gain reduction out of that, if you were boosting your gain, or if you were using your output. Because I mean, I know like a lot of times I'm gain staging all my plugs throughout the mastering process to keep everything from clipping on the outputs. So when I get to the C4, then I just didn't know if I was getting enough gain reduction to where it's gluing the whole track together, or is it doing enough at where it's set at right now?
Okay. Do you have a limiter at the end of the chain as well?
Yes.
Okay, so the limiter at the end of the chain should mean that you don't need to worry about clipping. I wouldn't worry too much about clip because all the major DAWs these days are 32-bit floating point.
Right.
So you could, if you just have a channel fader, you can clip a channel, and it shouldn't cause a problem because it will either get limited cleanly at the end of the chain, or you could pull it back later.
Right.
The exception to that is if you have plugins that model analog equipment. So if you say had the Waves SSL channel strip,
Right.
that behaves like a real piece of analog gear. So if you push it really hot, it will distort it in a similar way to an actual analog piece of gear.
Okay.
So that's kind of part one, which is don't worry too much about the clipping, providing you have a clean limiter at the end. In terms of how much gain reduction you're getting, the way that I like to work, I mean, you've seen, so I have the multiband set up. If something is reasonably well mixed and dynamically controlled and balanced EQ wise, when I run it through with the settings that I have, I would expect to see 2 or 3 dBs gain reduction in any one band, any one time, so nothing major. And I'd expect that to sound really invisible. So then the question is that enough? And the answer is, if it sounds good, then yes. Every so often I'll do that, and I'm thinking it still sounds, it doesn't feel glued enough together to me. And at that point, I would reduce the thresholds. Well, in the Melder production, you've got this nice thing called temp gain, where you drag it up and it boosts the input gain and it pulls down the output gain. So you end up with the overall level staying the same, but you can just get more compression in every band. So that's a nice, really nice feature. If you have a compressor that does that, you could do that. If not, you're going to have to do it yourself by pulling down the thresholds and then tweaking the levels. I mean, you said, does it change the gain at all? You can figure that out for yourself by just, for example, the mid-range. If you just pull the threshold way down on the mid-range, if there's an auto gain function on the multiband, you will hear the mix start to sound very mid-rangey, right? Because as you pull the threshold down, the auto gain will push the gain of the band back up. Right. So that's a quick and easy way to check whether you have auto gain or not. From what you've said, I suspect you don't.
Yeah, it's not an auto gain. There's four different slots, and there's one under each individual band. It's right above where the threshold is, and you have the option to turn them all up, or you can turn them up individually. And so, like, I've noticed, like, in some areas, normally where the bass is at, you get a lot more movement on the line. So probably maybe 2 to 3 dB gain reduction. On your high end, barely none at all. So I didn't know if maybe, you would go in and use any of those gains to maybe get a little bit more, use out of that section of it, or if you just left it all on and let it do whatever it was doing at that particular moment.
So sometimes I would. Usually I don't. But sometimes I do, and that's if I'm wanting more of that kind of glued together feeling. If it's still feeling like things are sticking out, and it's just not cohesive enough.
Right.
And the other way, you could either pull down all of the bands, or you could just lift up the input gain and pull down the output gain, right? So that the overall level going into the compressor is higher. In fact, that's quite a clue as to whether you need more compression overall. If you keep being tempted to push the gain up because you like the fact that it starts to sound more glued together with the gain higher, but it's reading too high on the meters, or it's just sounding too high to you, that's probably a clue that you need more overall gain reduction in the bands. So then that would be a case for pushing up the input level and pulling down the output level after the multiband.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't worry if there's no... I mean, it also depends what the music's doing, right? Because you might get lots of activity in the chorus, say, and not so much in the verse because the verse is quieter. Right. All of that stuff is fine if it sounds good to you. And because I'm all about being minimal, really I'm happier the less the compressors are doing. Right. So it's just the case that I kind of ignore the fact that there's a compressor there, just work on figuring out what level I want it to be and what EQ I want. And then I kind of take a step back and think, okay, how does this sound to me? Is it glued together enough? Is it a bit sticking out? Does it sound uncontrolled still? And that's when I might choose to have more or less of that overall control.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, like I said, it's really a subtle change. So whenever I put it on and I go through all the settings or whatever, if I A and B it, I mean, you can tell that everything kind of tightens up a little bit, but it's nothing it's nothing crazy or out of the norm. It's real minimal and real subtle sounding. So, I mean, I just, like I said, I didn't really know if you were going in and getting any more gain reduction to get more volume out, or if it was just more or less to try to color it and try to glue it all together at that point.
It's kind of both. I mean, the good thing, the thing that I like about multiband, because there are mastering engineers out there who hate multiband. You know, they say it's the devil and you should never go near it. The reason that I like it is that you can do more compression and it be transparent.
Right.
So, for example, if you've got something with a really thumpy kick drum, you can get control of that kick drum without causing pumping anywhere else. So if you did an experiment, if you got something set up with your multiband so it sounded good, then put in, you know, a Waves, an SSL bus compressor or some other kind of 2-bus compressor in the chain as well, bypassed the multiband and balanced up the levels of the compression so that they sounded similar, and then flicked one on and one off. Sorry, I banged the mic. I would expect you'd hear more of the compression side effects that we're used to, you know, the pumping, the breathing sound with the single band compressor than with the multiband.
Right.
That's mainly the point of it. I mean, the other good thing about it is that the glue effect is because you can, I mean, so to turn it around, I don't recommend that people have a multiband on the output of a mix. And the main reason for that is it makes you lazy. You know, you could throw almost anything into a multiband compressor and it will come out with something that sounds kind of all right. Because if there's a bit too much going on in the mid-range, it will compress it more. Or if there's a bit too much happening in the bass range, more will happen there. So the problem with that is if you then bypass the compressor, the mix just falls to pieces. And to me, I mean, I just think if you're trying to learn to mix well, that's not going to help you. You know, far better to get rid of that, get the mix to sound as good as you possibly can, and then use the multiband for that final gentle sweetening stage if you need to.
Right.
So yeah, it's completely fine that it's not doing that much. I mean, it's also completely fine if it's working quite hard. I mean, it's interesting for you guys mastering often your own stuff, or maybe from one or two people, versus the professional situation where you might have, you know, death metal in the morning and classical in the afternoon. Because when you're working on it day in, day out as a pro, you get such a variety that you end up seeing everything. You see stuff where the multiband is just 6 dBs of gain reduction in every band, and then other projects where you just bypass it. I think if you're only seeing a few dBs of gain reduction in every band, it's definitely worth bypassing it and seeing whether you actually need it at all. Usually I'm like you, I hear a subtle kind of change and pulling together, and I think, well, it's not doing any harm and I quite like it, so I'm going to leave it there. But sometimes you have something that's really well mixed and is really well controlled dynamically, and you just think, yeah, it doesn't need it. So in that situation, I would bypass it completely. So yeah, the answer is it can do all of those things, but I'm happiest when it's kind of in a real minimalist role.
Okay, I got you.
Did anybody else have any other questions following on from that? Nope, I'm not hearing anything, so...
Well, if nobody has any questions, I have one more question, and then I'm pretty much done.
Okay.
I mean, I kind of understand all of it. I just had a couple of issues. Mm-hmm. On your videos, whenever you do all your processes, and I've kind of learned, you know, those processes that they were totally different from what I thought. You know, I never really. I think the biggest thing that kind of changed my overall perception of all of it was inserting the gain at the beginning. I was always under the impression you mix it and then you get all your volume back with the limiter, and I always fell short, and the mix always broke down, and it never got as loud, and it was just never there. Well, now I'm closer to that industry standard than I've ever been before. But I guess what my question is when, and like I said, I do all the gain staging just because I've always gone through all that with, as far as clipping goes. I've just always been kind of nervous of it. So if I see something and it's like maybe a half dB over and I see that clip light come on, I'll gain stage it back a half a dB, and I'll just keep everything from hitting that point either way. And I'm still getting to around -11 RMS is what my final level is now. But I guess what the question I'm asking is what on your limiter, because I've never seen you put this on any of your videos, and this is what I've been wanting to ask is what is your gain reduction on your limiter? what do you think is acceptable? What is too much? When are you getting too much limiting? And I mean, when because I mean, all of your songs come out the exact same. And I mean, from your videos when you put them all side by side, and I mean, and mine are doing it now too, and mine are all normally around that -11 RMS threshold. So I feel, and the thing that I've noticed the most is my gain reduction on my limiter. None of them are going over about -4. So, or I'm getting about 4 dBs of gain reduction on, that's what my limiter is getting per track. So is that sufficient? Do you think I should push it more to get more volume, or does it matter? Is that too much? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
If when you say -11 RMS, are you using a VU meter and that means it's not quite reaching 0 when it's calibrated to -10, or do you just have an RMS meter?
Well, I've got it set on 0, and it's hitting the 0, and it's peaking at +1 on the VU meter. But if I pull up my leveling meter in Logic, it'll show it, and it has a peak that'll hit about -11 RMS.
I think the RMS meter in Logic is wrong. Just bear with me. I'm going to check. Because there are two forms of RMS. Let me just Google for this and see whether I'm talking nonsense or not. Googling for my own blog post. Yeah, the Logic 9 multimeter. I haven't checked it in Logic X, but the Logic 9 multimeter gives the incorrect RMS reading. Basically, RMS can be calibrated with a sine wave or with a square wave. And the question, and they come out different, and one of them is 3 dBs too low. So if your RMS meter in Logic is reading -11, the actual reading is -8. Okay. Which is exactly where I think the maximum, that's why I recommend your loudest stuff should be.
Right.
So that agrees with what you're seeing on the VU meter. So that means, in my opinion, you're doing fine. I'll just paste that link for anybody who's interested into the event chat so that you guys, anybody else, can check it out. I see a question from somebody there just saying, can you watch this later? And the answer is yes. This is going to be stored on YouTube. I'll edit out the mess at the beginning, and then I was only saying my volume is much lower than everybody else. Don is here. Good, I'll answer Don's question. Okay, so yeah, so that's the answer with the RMS. In terms of the amount of total gain reduction on the limiter, it's kind of a how long is a piece of string question, but I would say 4 is about the threshold where I start to, I'm not saying it's a problem, but it's where I start to look at it and go, maybe that's too much. 6, definitely. I'm kind of looking at it and thinking that's probably too much, and more than 6 dBs gain reduction on a limiter. There aren't that many limiters that can do that and still sound good. The advantage of working the way that I recommend, where you have a compressor, is that whatever the limiter is dealing with is likely to be transient information right from the very beginning of the any peak or spike that's in the wave, rather than the whole thing. I mean, there's another experiment you guys can do, which is if you have something where you've set it up, where you've got some compression of some kind going on and then some limiting, providing the compressor is set up so that it doesn't affect the gain too much, if you just bypass that compressor and then listen to the difference between your master with compression and limiting and just with limiting, usually the version just with limiting will sound worse. You'll start to hear more kind of that blunting, dulling of the sound. You might start to hear some distortion, or it just starts to sound generally overcooked, and that's because the limiter is working on more of the waveform because the compressor isn't there to kind of handle. I always think of it as the compressor handling the body of the sound and the limiter handling the peaks. So if you were just using a limiter, I would probably say 2 or 3 dBs. Any more than that of pure limiting is probably too much. But if you're using a compressor and a limiter, then I think 4 dBs is probably okay. 6 dBs is on the edge. Anything more than 6, maybe you should be looking at, you know, maybe the EQ isn't quite balanced, or maybe you need, I mean, that's another case where you might want to add more general compression to kind of glue things together a bit more, to control it a bit more before it hits the limiter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And you can see what I noticed the other day, and this is what I've been trying to do, is I know
Daniel, hi.
Hello.
you were talking about the EQ balance, and I never really understood what you were talking about until the last video you showed it, and everything was pretty much sitting on the line and wasn't really going over 0, but then that kick was kind of coming over and it had that big hump over the top, and then you balanced that out. And so then I went back and I was like, well, let me look at some of my mixes. And I looked and I could see where I was just all over the place. And so I went back in and I took all the plugs and everything off of my mix, and I just used nothing but the SSLG channel. And then I went back to try to do. I said I'm just gonna take all this stuff out of the mix, only use compression where I think I need it, and just try to get a way cleaner mix. And I had a great EQ curve, and everything was pretty much flat across the board. And whenever I went into the mastering stage, it felt like everything came together a lot faster, and there wasn't as much stuff. You know, there wasn't as many problem areas that I had to deal with, and there wasn't as much, you know, issues here and there. And so, I mean, I kind of see where that EQ balance makes a definite difference. And so, I mean, that was. But I guess since I've done that, like I said, I still got the same result as far as the same RMS level. But I just didn't. I didn't have to do as much to get to that same point. So.
And I think that's a positive thing, you know, if you're still happy with the result of it at the end, and that's a common thing that I see is, you know, people keep. Hey Daniel, do you mind muting your mic? I think maybe.
Oh yeah, sorry.
It's okay. It's just I can hear hard drive fan or something in the background. Cool. Feel free to unmute at any point and ask a question if you want to. I said to the other guys, feel free to jump in.
Okay.
So I'm going to post another link in the event chat, which is to a video about balanced EQ, because balanced EQ is critical. And yeah, so just to go back to what I was saying before, people often send me their mastering change and say, what do you think of this? And they have a list of like 7 or 8 plugins. And that to me immediately rings alarm bells. You know, as you've seen on the course, most of the time it's EQ, compression and limiting and nothing else. And I think the more stuff you throw in, you have different processes, fighting against each other, where, you know, maybe you put it through the Slate VTM plugin and it adds a kind of nice bass hump, which you quite like, but then it sounds a bit bassy, so you EQ a bit of that bass out, and then you add something else that adds some nice color to the upper mid-range, but it also makes it a bit bright. So then you know, so you've got one plugin and it just kind of, quite often if you just bypass all of those and go in with a single EQ and a single compressor, you can get something that sounds, the end result is the same, because at the end of the day, our taste, you know, we know how we want things to sound. That's why we're sound engineers. So getting there the fastest you can is often the best way to do it. And my personal philosophy is the same for mixing. I believe that about mixing too. You know, when I mix, I will start off with no EQ, no compression, and I just get it as good as I can just using fader moves and pan. And you know, if there's an EQ problem somewhere, like low end out of control somewhere or something horribly bright, then I'll fix that. And then everything's just added gently after that. And the less I can do, the happier I am, and the faster everything comes together. So yeah, I definitely think that's the way to go. But in mastering, the EQ balance, having a balanced EQ going into the compressor and the limiter is key in my opinion. And yeah, the link that I pasted in the chat there has a demonstration of that for anybody who's interested.
Okay. Also, do you the thing that you have your mastering course is obviously which we're in now, but the EQ video, I guess it's like a separate thing. Does that go into more of the mixing side does that go into more of getting a balanced EQ, or is it more on the mastering side?
It's very much aimed at mastering, but people have said to me that they found it useful in their mixing as well. it's basically, it's kind of it's a real blow by blow account of how I think about EQ and how I hear EQ, and some suggestions about how you might develop the way you hear EQ. And I'm demonstrating using whole mixes, and I'm talking about whole mixes, but you know, let me think of an example. Okay, so when I think of 100 hertz, I think it's boomy, and it's kind of ooh, 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 boo. You've got the ooh sound in boomy, so I always remember it in my head as if it sounds boomy, it could be 100 hertz, because that's where you kind of get that ooh frequency. That kind of strategy, knowing that kind of stuff, you can apply that in mixing or mastering or wherever. You know, it applies all over the place. So, I mean, what I would say is give it a try. You know, I mean, I'm like everything. If it's not what you'd hoped for or what you needed, then I can refund you. You know, I want what people buy to be useful. But yeah, it's definitely this course is kind of an overview. You know, it's how you put everything together and make it work. And if you want more in-depth kind of exactly what I think about EQ and how it works and stuff, then that's the EQ course. And I'm working on a course on compression and limiting at the moment. There is the multiband compression ebook, which kind of goes through why I have the settings I do and how I use them in more detail as well. And I deliberately tried to not double it up, you know, because if I put everything in the Masterclass course, there'd be no point in having those other products. But also, if somebody had both, then they'd be kind of sitting in one going, well, I know all of this, you know. It's so yeah, I would say if you want more information on those topics, kind of give it a try and see how you get on.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll let some of these other guys come in and get it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll go back to my list. Nice to talk to you.
I definitely appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, so Daniel, you're in the call now. Are you the Daniel who asked me about loudness?
Yeah, I asked about the loud EDM masters because I wanted to know how would you approach that in case a client ever comes and asks to master a track like that. So
there's a couple of different answers to that. The first one, I will give you a link. Which you might have seen by now. There's a video where I demonstrate using an EDM track where the guy wants it really loud, and there's a lot of it's a free video. It's on my site, but let me paste that into the event for you guys. So I don't think I'll talk too much about that. What I would say is try watching that video and then come back to me if you have questions, and we can answer them in the next Q&A.
Okay, sounds good.
The other answer to it, actually, there's also a blog post on this, is I do try and persuade people not to make it too loud. I mean, so I'm now at a place where if somebody comes to me, when somebody comes to me as a new client, the first thing I do is say, how loud do you want it? And if they give me a reference that is louder than I think is going to be good for the music, then I will say, you know, I'm really sorry. I don't enjoy making stuff that loud. You know, I've tried, and the process for me is, you know, you master it, it doesn't sound loud enough, so you turn it up a bit. Okay, that sounds louder, but it sounds crap. So you turn it down a bit, and it sounds good again, but it's not loud enough. So you turn it. There's just for me, this course with the recommendations I give are the absolute limit. Beyond RMS/VU at kind of -8 for the really loud stuff, I just think it's downhill all the way from there. In fact, there's a blog post I haven't written yet. I want to do an infographic for it. It's this idea I have of the loudness cliff. You know, loudness is a mountain that everybody wants to climb, and you want to go up and you go up and you go up, and then there's a benefit and there's a benefit and the closer you get, the more the benefits start to stop and they tail off, and then whoa, you're over the edge and you plummet down the other side and end up on the rocks. And if you go much louder than what I'm suggesting in the course, I think you end up on the rocks one way or another, either with distortion or just loss of life and impact and all the rest of it. So what happens when I say I really think you'd probably get a better result with somebody else is usually people well, about 3/4 of I'd say yes, 3 out of 4 times people say, well, we'll do it your way anyway, and we'll see what it sounds like. So I do the master, and they say, well, it sounds great, and it's completely loud enough. Because I think lots of people know in theory that they want it loud, but they don't actually have a hard and fast concept of what that should be, and they don't really want it loudness war loud. They just want it, to sound great and to stand up against everything else that's out there. So most of the time, yeah, people are happy with what I do, even though I don't master loud by modern standards. Because the difference between, we're only talking a couple of dBs, really. That's the kind of the strain, the difference between being at the top of the cliff and falling off the edge is only 2 or 3 dBs. If they are kind of interested but not persuaded, then I use iTunes to try and persuade them that I'm right, and that's where I'm going to give you the link. Again, it's a blog post on my site. Let me see if I can find it. I can't remember what to Google for to find this one, so I have to scroll back. It's not that far back. There it is. So the short version is, if you import stuff into iTunes and enable sound check, it evens out the loudness. So if you do 2 masters of a song, one of it really loud and the other one less loud, import them both into iTunes and play them back to back, they will hear them in a real world scenario. That's how it's going to sound if it gets played back on YouTube or iTunes Radio or Spotify or any of these places. And usually the louder one, the more squashed one, doesn't sound as good, because when the replay loudness is the same, the dynamics become more important in terms of making it sound good. But there's quite a lot more detail in this blog post, and I'll paste that into the event comments. So yeah, again, have a look at that and then get back to me. The funny thing about the video where I show you kind of strategies for making it loud is there comes a point where I've got it really loud and I decide that it sounds too clean. And at that point, I start adding in some saturation to make it sound more grungy. That's because he said, how do I make my music sound like this example? So I was working with a reference. I don't think it sounds better. I think it's, and if you look through the comments on the YouTube channel, you'll see that lots of people agree with me. They prefer the less super loud version. But in general, you want to use more aggressive compression settings than I recommend on the course. You probably need to use some soft clipping. Jason mentioned clipping, that used in small amounts, it can be really effective, and quite a good way to lift the level whilst keeping the aggression in there. And then some limiting probably as well. And I think if you play around, I mean, the other thing to say is that the song needs to have enough loudness potential in it. A lot of the really, like the example you sent me, I could paste that into the chat window so that people could have a listen to it later if they would like. This is the song that Daniel said, how would you go about getting this loud? I don't know whether this is true. The anecdote I've heard, Skrillex is one of the loudest EDM artists around. I have heard that, everybody knows about side chaining the bass off the kick drum. So every time the kick drum comes up, you duck the bass out of the way, because our ear doesn't perceive the fact that the bass is missing, and it makes space for the kick drum to sit in there. Otherwise, you get sudden pulse of bass energy that's going to crack up and distort everything. You can do that automatically, called sidechaining. I have heard that Skrillex does that by hand individually for every single kick drum beat. I don't know whether that's true, but that's an example of how the mix is designed with loudness potential. If you have an EDM track where the bass is side-chained off the kick, you will be able to push it harder into a limiter or a clipper or a compressor without negative side effects. And the same thing applies through the whole arrangement and mixing process. If you start off with sounds that are very compressed, and if you use mixing strategies where your goal is loudness, you're more likely to achieve the result that you're looking for and still have it sound good or okay. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Did anybody have any follow-ups on that before I
Yeah,
move on to
I
the
have
next
one.
question? Yeah.
Okay, so let's say I have a client and he sends me an EDM mix for me to master, and I listen to the mix and I think the mix doesn't work. So from the business side, it is better to turn off that client away because I won't be able to do what he wants and I will turn out bad in the end. So it might be better to turn it down if he has a bad mix. Do you think or not?
Yes, but I think it's a case of degree. So I quite often get mixes that are almost there but not quite. So if it's that just that there's a few things that are not quite right, then I will usually go back and say something like, this sounds really good. I really like this, 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 and this. I think it would sound even better if you did this. And then say again how much you like it. That's called a no sandwich, right? You have a yes, a positive, followed by a no. You need to change this, followed by a yes at the end. So they start off feeling good. They hear something they don't want to hear, and then they end up feeling good at the end of it. When you do that, you get probably 3 responses. There's no, it's perfect. I want it exactly as it is. In which case, I just get on and master it. Yes, you're absolutely right. That's a great idea. I'll do that. Or, okay, 4 responses. Yes, that's absolutely great. I'll do that. And then they send you something that is still not right and maybe wrong in a different way, or just they completely misunderstood what you said. Or then the final option is, I don't know whether I can do that. If you get the feeling that the client is not going to be able to achieve what they want, what you want, which I think is what you're talking about, you then have to make a decision. You could either suggest that they send you stems if you think that it's something that you can work on yourself, and you like the idea of doing it, and I would usually ask them to pay more in that case because it takes longer. Or you politely say, it's hard to tell somebody their stuff is not good enough. You can take the route of kind of saying, I don't think I'm quite right for this, or, I don't feel I'm going to be able to achieve quite what you're looking for, and I think you might get a better result somewhere else. And sometimes you have to say, the kind of the language that I use is, I think there are other places where you could get more value out of the investment of money and time than from mastering. I think you would benefit from looking at the arrangement of this song, or maybe working on the vocalist with some areas. And I used to do some of that stuff with people. These days I don't really have time, so I now recommend they go to Mike Senior, who has written for Sound on Sound magazine for years, and he has a thing called Mix Rescue in there. And one of the things he does is work with clients to help them get better results in their mixes. And whenever I do that, I always get a good response, because you're saying, I don't think this is quite ready yet, but here's a way that you can get closer to what you want. And I think in the end, they will be happy with that. I mean, you also get people who you never hear back from them because they're just obviously offended by the fact that you said their stuff wasn't ready. But, that's life. I think that's a better result for me than, like you say, either ending up with something that you're not happy with the way it sounds and you're not happy to have your name on it, or having something where the client isn't happy with the result that you got despite your best efforts. I mean, I would say the worst kind of client is the one who can hear that it's bad but expect you to fix it. Because they come in and say, oh, the guitars are all over the place and the bass is out of control and this, that, and the other, but you can sort all of that out, right? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And if the answer is no, that's a difficult situation to be in. So I would say at least 50 to 60% of the time, even if there are problems I feel there are problems in the mix, I just go ahead and master it. Because usually people come to you right at the end of the process and they want to get it released and they don't want to hear no, they just want to hear the best result you can get from what they've done. So that's the usual case. And then the rest of the time, it's kind of a mixture of maybe you can make some adjustments, or sorry, I don't think, you're quite ready yet. Does that answer the question? Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. You still muted?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
So basically, if there are only a few problems in the mix, you will try to communicate with the client and explain to him. So let's say a kick drum is too loud, you tell the client, okay, turn it down, and the master will be better eventually. But if the mix is a complete mess, then you either have to tell him you are not the guy for him, or to come back when the mix is more polished or whatever.
Yeah,
That is kind of what he's saying.
yeah, pretty much. I think quite a lot of what I master, the mix is not quite there. And I don't know how long you've been doing mastering, but after you've been doing it a while, you start to very quickly get an instinct for the stuff that you can fix and the stuff that you can't. Like a kick drum that's too big might well be controllable with multiband compression. You know, you put in a little notch on the EQ to tame it in the first place, then the compression controls it, and maybe you boost the bass a little bit somewhere else with a broader Q to kind of keep the overall feeling of weight in the low end there. So that kind of thing, quite often, that's just part of mastering. But then, well, just to use an extreme example, every so often I get something where something is, the polarity has been flipped on one channel, you know, so quite often for some reason it's piano. So it sounds, sorry, it sounds all kind of out here and out of control in the stereo image. And then you hit the mono button and the instrument just disappears because most of it cancels. You know, that's, you can't do anything about that in the mastering. That just is what it is. It's a mix problem. You have to go back to it. So that's a kind of clear-cut position where you go to the client and say you need to fix it. At the other end, there's kind of tweaks, and then there's this kind of grey area in between. And it's, you know, it's up to us to figure out what we're comfortable and happy. I know there are some engineers who throw almost everything they get sent back. And one of the major kind of things that they offer to their clients is an opinion that it's, you know, there's something you need to fix and it's not ready yet, and that's a big part of the mastering process for them. I tend to be more like, I'm just going to get on with it most of the time, but every so often there'll be something that makes me think I need to talk to somebody more about it.
Yeah, okay, I understand everything you said. Pretty cool.
Okay, excellent. Now Don was on the call earlier. Oh no, he's watching, isn't he? He's not in the call. So Don wanted to, it's a common question, this. He says, my question has to do with bitrate and upsampling and mastering. At the end of the day, we have to export at 44.1 or 48 for DVDs. Would you recommend upsampling files to, say, 96 kilohertz at the start of the mastering process in order for the plugins in the chain to do their processing with higher precision before downsampling to the final export sample rate? In other words, does upsampling make for a better final master, all things being equal? If so, how would you recommend doing it? And is it any better to upsample in integer multiples, the 44 to 88, as opposed to 44 to 96? So I don't usually upsample, Don, unless, say, I've got 2/3 of the tracks are at 96 and then a couple of them are at 44, for example, then I would upsample the 44 ones so that everything is at the same resolution. There's no intrinsic benefit in upsampling. There should be no change in quality at all. It is true that some non-linear plugins, so things like clippers, amp modeling stuff, maybe some reverbs, maybe some compressors, can have problems at 44.1 kilohertz up near 20 kilohertz with the aliasing frequency, the filter that smooths everything out in the high end. But rather than upsampling, I will tend to use plugins that oversample to overcome that. And if I'm completely honest, I'm not 100% sure I can ever hear it. You know, I mean, those problems that we're talking about are very high frequency, and there are people who swear that they're the devil. That's not my experience. I've yet to hear an example where I was kind of utterly convinced that the oversampled version was better. But since we typically are not using much CPU power in mastering, and since the option is there, why not oversample and avoid that problem? So yeah, I would usually use oversampling in the plugins instead, but you could upsample by all means. On the other hand, you use twice as much disk space. if you're going to upsample, I personally don't think there's any point in going above 96. 192 kilohertz just to me seems like a nonsense. I did some listening tests. I haven't done it recently. I did some listening tests about 6 years ago. I can hear the difference between 48 and 44. There's it's maybe 1 or 2% difference. I couldn't hear a difference between 96 and 48 on the examples I tested there, which, if you're interested, was an SACD of some really nice acoustic jazz. It was a Blu-ray of, no, not a Blu-ray, an SACD of Dark Side of the Moon, and some 96 kilohertz recordings of piano that I'd done myself. Maybe with other examples I would have heard something different. That's not a scientific test, but for me, 96 is ample. 48 is probably ample. And the final question, is it better to upsample in integer multiples? No. Modern sample rate conversion is very high quality. It makes no difference. Having said that, I think I've already given you this link in the course, but there is a site where you can compare the quality. Not all sample rate conversion is great and high quality. And there's a place where you can go and get an idea of how good or bad yours is. It's src.infinitewave.ca. I'll paste that into the event window so you guys can check it out. If you want to see an example of something that's pretty damn good, look for the Vice Saracen. And if you want to see something that's pretty bad, look for Acom Digital. That'll give you an idea of how those graphs should look. But I mean, even the sample rate conversion that's built into OS X these days is very high quality. Ever since the Mastered for iTunes thing, they've really got their act together. So you shouldn't have a problem finding some really great quality sample rate conversion if that's what you want to do. So hopefully that answers your question, Don. I'm just going to head over to the event and see if you're still there. Feel free to ask me a follow-up question if you are, or if anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Who's that?
I've got a question regarding the mix bus. So if you will be doing both the mixing and mastering of a particular song or material, what process do you think should normally be left for the mastering, and what's your opinion on the mix bus? I mean, should you use more on the mix bus for the flavor and just leave the the finishing level touches for the for the mastering? I mean, if you're doing it yourself, both the mixing and mastering, so you can have a choice on that. What's your option? What's your opinion about that? I know it's a long and dirty, between the mix bus and mastering. And
the answer I usually give is I try and make the mix as good as it possibly can be. So I would try and do everything in the mix. An ideal mastering session would just be tiny little EQ changes, tiny little bit of limiting, and a little bit maybe of EQ here and there, just to balance things. In reality, that's not usually the case. I don't use compression on the mix bus. I leave that to the mastering stage. That's a taste thing. Lots of people mix through compressors, and that's absolutely fine. If you do it, I would recommend that you're more. It depends what kind of sound you're going for. There are some genres where that mix bus compression sound is part of the sound, so it's kind of essential. I would never use limiting, and I don't recommend you use multiband compression on a stereo mix.
You can throw the phase off, is it?
No, it's like I said earlier on when I was talking to Jason, that I think it's easy to use multiband compression as a crutch. I think it's better to if there's a problem with something sticking out in the mid range, if you can get it better in the mix by applying compression to that individual thing or riding the fader or whatever it is, I think it's better to do it that way than relying on a multiband compressor. And I think if you get, just say for the sake of argument, if you're used to always having the wave C4 on the stereo output of your mixer, and then one day either your iLok blows up or you have to go and work somewhere where they don't have that plug-in, suddenly you're not going to be able to work, whereas if you don't rely on that in the mix, I think that's a healthier place to be, and you will end up being more skilled working in that way. Limiters, I just don't see the point of having a brick wall limiter in a mix session. If it's not loud enough, turn up the monitor gain. Leave the peaks, leave them to the mastering engineer, because limiting twice is probably going to sound ugly. It's very easy to overdo it, and you can't take it off once. Well, I guess if you've still got access to the session files, you can go back and reprint it. But it just doesn't. The whole point for me of a limiter is to be invisible. I'm not talking about kind of say an 1176 or a Fairchild or something within the mix for color or for some kind of artistic effect. That's different, but I wouldn't put those myself on the mix bus just for controlling level, because I just don't see the point of that. So a digital brick wall limiter on the mix bus would be no good. Is there anything else that I would leave to the... I don't worry about how songs relate to each other, particularly when I'm mixing. I mix each song as it is, because I know that when I get to the mastering stage, I'm going to adjust the relative levels and the EQ and all the rest of it.
You're just focusing on each song to make it as better as you can possibly do it. On the mixing, and just leave the volume changes and tiny bits of matching between each song to the mastering process.
Yeah, exactly, because that's mastering. The analogy I make is that when you're mixing, you're balancing the tracks in a song to make a song. When you're mastering, you're balancing songs in an album to make an album. So it's almost like you have each song on its own fader instead of having each instrument on its own fader.
Very good example.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And actually, you can work that way. When I first left my full-time job, and the studio closed, so I couldn't use their studio anymore. I had no proper DAW other than Logic, so I was doing some mastering in Logic, and I would have each song on its own track in the mixer, and I'd have them kind of arranged in a diagonal line, first song there, second song there, so that they weren't all playing at the same time, and then I would have plugins on each channel of the mixer to apply the processing that I needed to master that song. Now I'm working in Wavelab, and you can put the effects on individual clips, which is a nicer way of working for me. But yeah, there's no reason, and in that way you could use the channel faders to tweak the levels and get everything balanced. So yeah, individual EQs, individual levels, overall limiting, overall loudness, all of that is mastering stuff. And then in mixing, you have to keep a kind of global. If you're producing an album and you've got 10 songs, you have to kind of keep in mind that this acoustic guitar ballad is going to have to sit next to the thrash metal track and the EDM thing at the end, and somehow make sure they don't get too far apart from each other. But I don't. It's not like I put multiple songs in the same session or flick between sessions, referencing one against the other. Personally, that's. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Cheers.
Great, pleasure. I'm going to check back again and see whether Don... Yeah, Don's got back to me. Thanks for the detailed answer. Top-down mixing seems to be the in thing. Yeah, Graham talking about it. And Mixer Man as well is very big on having... So if you guys haven't heard of top-down mixing, it's the idea that actually the exact opposite of what I just said, where you put loads of stuff on the two bus, and then kind of particularly compression, and then you pile everything into it. It works. They're great mixers who use that technique, and get great results. That's not the way that I work personally, because I feel like maybe that's a rule of thumb for me. If I bypass something on the mix bus and everything falls to pieces, it was doing too much, because then it's not my mix that's holding it together, it's the compressor. And I mean, there are so many big names who disagree with that, you know. Well, so Dave Pensado, I don't think uses very much mix bus processing at all, whereas Andrew Sheps, I think, just has compression everywhere. I mean, I've heard an interview where he's saying he genuinely doesn't have any real clue what any individual compressor is doing. You know, he might have 5 tracks going to one compressor and then 3 of those tracks going to another one along with 2 other tracks. So they all kind of interact with each other and move around in this kind of magical way. And he ends up with something that he likes. You know, all power to him. That doesn't work for me. But I am very much more a mastering engineer than a mixing engineer. And I think mastering is much more kind of controlling, you know, analytical. It's still a creative process. It's still an artistic process. But I think working as a pro, you have to respect whatever material is given to you. Yeah, I think a more kind of hands-off approach is where I'm coming from.
All right, Ian, on a quick question for you. Well, actually 2, but the first one is pretty straightforward. It should be pretty easy to answer. When you master a song, let's say for a big-time artist or someone that's going on the radio, are you mastering that at the same level to give that to a radio station that's going to recompress it to send it out over their airwaves, or are you mastering it different to take into consideration that they're going to recompress it to put it on their system and broadcast?
I master everything the same.
Okay.
I mean, there are engineers out there who do one master for vinyl, they do one master for MP3, they do one master for radio, they do one. I just don't do that. I believe that you can get one master that translates everywhere.
Right.
The trouble with radio processing is it's different from every station. They all have different processors, and even if they have the same processor, there are like 10 different presets that they could have, and they will have chosen one. You know, we have no control over what FM radio makes music sound like.
Right.
I don't know whether you've seen, there's a post on my site called Radio Loudness the Truth or something, where I have 3 different examples of the same song, same mix, having gone through broadcast processing on 3 different settings. They all come out sounding almost identical in terms of loudness and EQ, even though they sounded quite different going in. It's just that the louder they get, the more distorted the final result is.
Right.
Yeah, I found the link for that. I'll paste that into the QnA.
Okay.
Here we go. So yeah, take a listen to that for yourself. Yeah, the same guidelines that I'm putting forward on the course, they're what I use myself. Well, I master slightly quieter these days. I think I added a note about that in one of the early resource pages. Just maybe a dB or 2 lower than the examples that I'm showing you on the course. It's not to say it's going to cause you a problem, but for me, I'm loving the dynamics more and more.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of the EQ balance and the overall loudness and all the rest of it, that stuff, I mean, those masters have been sent. They've been sent to Abbey Road for vinyl cutting, and I've been told they've been pressed flat. And people use them on CD, and people encode them to MP3s, and they get played on the radio, and it all sounds great. So that to me is the right way to go.
I know. I also I mix my own music. I make my own, produce, my own music, stuff like that. So on my monitoring system, I'm using a Lavery DA10 digital to analog converter from the computer, and then I have multiple sets of monitors set up. I have a set of just regular set of monitors. They're not great, but they're not horrible. And then I also have another set that's more or less like a Auratone or like the ref tones type things. And basically, what I'm doing with those is, you basically get the mix of more of your mid-range comes out of those Auratones, and you can kind of see where your problems are at in the mix. And then you can listen to your overall master or your overall mix on your other monitors, kind of see the placement. Excuse me. But I know my main monitors that I'm mixing through and producing through and now mastering through, they're not great. I've been looking at the Focal Solo 6s, and that's what I was planning on making an upgrade to. and just wanted to know your thoughts on monitors, and if you see a big time difference as far as the more higher quality monitor that you go to, the more precision you get as far as when you're mastering, or as far as translation goes. Because I know a lot of times I can go to a friend's house or whatever that has a studio, and I can mess around with some of his stuff, and then let's say he burns a CD. His monitors are so exaggerated that I take it out to the car, and the bass totally fell apart. But then if I do the same exact, if I take that exact song and bring it to my house and I mix it on mine, I know my room, I know the monitors, I know this, that, and the other, and I can make the bass translate. So, I mean, obviously, it has a lot to do with the ear and knowing your monitors, but do you feel like you can get a better process, a better translation from one point to the other without having to go to different monitoring as far as your car and, headphones and this, that, and the other, just by having better monitors?
I think translation and the overall quality of the monitors are two different things. So, for example, this is my home studio, and I've got it's still got the hi-fi speakers that I showed in the video that I put on my site when I set it up. They're £500, so they're $750. So they're good, but they're
Right.
not they're not mastering monitors. But having said that, when I listen to stuff on these, or maybe do a quick master on these, and then take it and check it in one of I have a friend who has some really nice monitors in his place, and when I take stuff out into the car and everywhere else, it all translates fine. So in terms of translation, they work great, and I think you could probably get some even cheaper monitors that would translate, because you're right, it's all about knowing how it should sound to you in the room, in the space. A lot of it is to do with experience. But then when you get to a certain point, you're actually not going to hear anything. So like the Auratones, if you just had those Auratones, you'd have a really hard time getting the low bass. Your mid-range would be good, but the highs and the lows, you just have a hard time knowing whether what you were hearing was real or not.
Right.
And there would just be stuff that you couldn't hear because they weren't capable of reproducing frequencies that low or that high. And I think as well, it's a very common experience for me to point out to clients faults that they haven't heard. So I'll say, oh, did you know that such and such was distorting? Or did you spot these clicks here? Or did you notice the hum there or the hiss there? And that is, again, a quality thing. You won't hear that on earbuds, to use an extreme example. And laptop speakers, and probably not on the Auratones, and probably not on kind of $150 set of monitors. I think you do have to have a certain level of quality in order to be able to hear that stuff, for the monitors to actually reproduce it well enough for you to hear it.
Right.
Now, that's not necessarily linked to price, because one of the things is I'm looking at these speakers here, and they're 10 going on 15 years old, but they're great, and I know them inside out, and I know from listening tests I've done, I would probably have to spend 10 times the price to get a real upgrade in terms of the quality.
Right.
And then the question is, would that be worthwhile or not in this room, and all the rest of it. So I think for the monitoring has to be good enough that you know that what you're hearing is reliable, that you know that you're not going to miss something. So far I have not had a client come back to me and say they have spotted a fault that I haven't. So that's all good. Whereas if I had lower quality monitors, I could imagine that happening, and that for me would be a problem. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think more expensive speakers will necessarily help things translate better, but they might well enable you to hear stuff that you otherwise wouldn't have picked out.
Right.
And do something about it. And that reminds me, I have a blog post. There's a trend now. How am I going to find that? Oh, is it Can You Trust Your Ears? No, it's if you can't.
There was a video of a mixing engineer out of New York City, and basically that's one of the things he was talking about. Was he went to uh, AES show or ASC show. What is it? AES?
AES, yeah.
Yeah. So he went to an AES show and he was walking around and he heard a song he mixed and mastered, and he heard some things wrong with it. And he was like, "What is that?" And so he wanted to know who was messing with his song. And so he walks by and he goes by this booth, and they have these brand new monitors out. And he says, "Well, you know, what are y'all doing to my mix?" And he says, "Well, we're just these are the tones recreating these speakers are just recreating, you know, what we have running through our music system." And so he's like, "Well, you know, I can hear problems with my mix and problems with my master, blah blah blah." So then he said he bought those speakers, and now, you know, he can see. Now I don't know if that was a whole buy and sell pitch, or, you know, how much money he got put, you know, give to say that or whatnot. And maybe it didn't even happen. Maybe that's the truth. But, you know, from the way that he was saying, you know, he could hear a difference as far as like spatial wise, where he could hear the mix get a little wider, or he could hear, you know, like some top end frequencies that were a little more ear piercing than what he could hear on his previous monitors, and he could hear a little bit of low end range that, you know, wasn't tight enough or whatnot. And he said that when he got these, that it kind of helped all that out. So I just, you know, wanted your opinion on that. If it, you know, if it was something where, you know, you've actually seen, you know, seen that live and in person or not.
So there's two sides to that. In the studio I used to work in at SRT, here this is just stereo, but in the SRT studio we had surround sound. So you had a left, a right, two rear speakers, and a center speaker. And many times when I was working there, I would get a client who was astonished to discover that center speaker wasn't switched on, because the center image they were hearing from the monitoring there was so clear and so defined, that they believed it was coming from that center speaker.
Right.
But when you're listening to stereo, it's just the left and the right.
Right.
So, and also, over and over again, as I say, people send me things and I say to them, "What do you want to do about this?" And they go, "I never even heard that." Now that might be their ears, but very often when people come in to attend a session, they can hear it as well, which tells me it's not their ears, it's the monitoring. And I've also worked in rooms where, yeah, I've done mixes where everything sounds fine, and then I bring it back and I listen to it on my own system or in one of the studios, and suddenly I hear all these problems. So
Right.
they're definitely, it's very possible for a monitoring system to mask problems, you know, to make you unaware that there is some super low frequencies going on, or that there is a resonance at this frequency or that frequency, and that will impair your ability to master effectively. Having said that, the flip side of it is, sounds like your friend probably did get a great pair of speakers because they were revealing things that he hadn't heard previously. But I sometimes get something where I take stuff out and listen to it, and I think, "Whoa, that doesn't sound right. That's not what I intended." Then the thing to do is put some other stuff on, and quite often you will then find that those speakers make everything sound like that.
Right.
So you know, say a kind of a really boomy bass. Well, Beats headphones, okay? Beats headphones add a kind of hump around a 100, 200 hertz to everything.
Right.
So whatever if you listen to something that has a balanced EQ on those, it will kind of, you know, it just has that bassy. It's and it's the way they're designed, and people who like them like that sound. But if you mastered on them, pretty much everywhere else in the world on any decent pair of speakers, if you made it sound balanced on a pair of Beats, it would have too little bass everywhere else, right?
Right.
Because you're hearing too much, so you undercompensate. And that kind of problem is very common. It's much more common for speakers to have problems than for them not to have problems, if you like.
Right.
I mean, even so, I have these speakers are B&Ws, and the ones that I had at SRT were B&Ws, but they were 4 times bigger and 20 times more expensive. But even within that brand, this model are great, and those big ones were great. But there's a pair that costs £4,000, that were floor standing, 2 or 3 drivers in them, much bigger than these, you would think, well, they're bound to sound better than these. And actually, for me, they don't. They don't sound as reliable. If I would to master on them, it wouldn't translate as well, and they would hide certain problems from me. So it's all about finding those magical monitors that tell you everything you need to know.
Right.
And I would say, I mean, if you're getting good results with what you've got, and you're not going out into the world and discovering all kinds of problems, then stick with it. By all means, I've heard lots of good things about the focals, so experiment. Don't just buy a pair and assume that they're going to sound better. Get a pair in from a dealership and try them for a few days or a week and see how they sound to you. And you may find that you hear all kinds of new stuff you never heard before. And
well, I've just heard that the focals are a little bit more neutral sounding. They're more natural, and the ones that I've got, they are a little bit exaggerated. I feel like if I go off and just listening to these speakers, I will have a lot more high end than like the low end. I mean, I can get a pretty good representation of it, and it translates pretty well. But the high end always seem to go overboard with these. But everyone else says, if you got the focals, they kind of represent almost exactly like it. So if it's a little bit too loud, it displays it. And that's, I guess it's just a fact of not wanting to keep walking around and translating in different places and send it to this person and ask them how it sounds and that kind of thing.
There's an extent to which you can cope with it. So I mean, these, for example, these are the Sennheiser 650s. They're really good headphones, but they're a little bit soft in high frequencies. Now I know that. And for a short period of time, I can kind of compensate. So I could work on them, and I would okay, this is going to sound a bit dull, and that's okay. But because who I am, I want to hear everything perfect. If I tried to work on these for a long period of time, I would become frustrated with the fact that I wasn't hearing those high frequencies the way that I wanted to.
Right.
And I can compensate for that by putting in a temporary EQ that lifts the high end a little bit, which is what I did when I did the videos for the Masterclass, because I did that on these. And that works, and then you disable it when you print the track, and then it'll work when you take it out into the real world. So there are ways of getting around it, but the ideal is to have monitoring that just sounds right to you. So I mean, if what you have, that it's slightly hyped or slightly coloured in certain ways, but if you like the way that it sounds in your room, and then when you take it out, it translates, you have a solution that's going to work for you. You might find that you get the focals, you put them up, and you make it sound the way that you like it in the room, and then you take it out, and actually it doesn't quite translate, because you were saying the ones you've got make things in the real world sound a bit toppy, is that right?
That's right.
So I guess they lack a little bit of really high frequency.
So right.
You're tempted in your room to put in a bit too much high frequency. You might find that when you get the focals, they actually sound too bright to you. And you end up, when you go out into the real world, everything sounds a bit dull. Or maybe you take the time to adjust. It's tough. It's a really delicate balancing act. And I think I said right at the beginning of the course, I'm lucky because I worked as a pro for all those years in a top flight mastering studio. So I had this back catalogue of stuff that I knew how it should sound. So all I do when I go into a new environment is use that back catalogue, and I just tweak things until it sounds right to me, and then I know I'm in the right ballpark.
Right.
And the challenge for anybody who hasn't got that is figuring out what is right. And I think the answer to that is to look for reference tracks, to look for stuff that sounds great to you everywhere in the world. If it sounds great in your car and great in your studio and great in your hi-fi and great in your mate's house, it probably sounds great. So if you then play that back in the studio and go, okay, this is my benchmark, that's the way that you tune in on what things should sound like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Appreciate it.
Cool. My pleasure. Okay, so it's getting pretty late here. I have a set of questions from Hamid, who I haven't seen him around, but I would like to answer them all so that we have a clean slate. So I will move fairly quickly through these. I think some of them we might have touched on. He says, what are the recommended, this is a different tack here, what are the recommended levels, loudness, dynamics range for mastering orchestral music? Mostly sampled, if that makes any difference. And what setting should I be aiming for on the VM2? VUMT. So Hamid, there are less rules with classical because it's so different to most of the other stuff that we're looking at on the course. There is a kind of soundtrack example in there. I can't remember whether that's happened yet or not. I think it might have done. I still use a VU calibrated in the same way. The difference is that most of the time it spends a lot of time below, because classical music tends to have some very loud sections and then lots of much quieter stuff, whereas pop and rock tend to you know, R&B, urban, all tend to be much more consistent in the loudness. So I don't worry if the needle is way down at the bottom of the scale a lot of the time. And if it gets far above 0 when it's calibrated to -10, then I probably start backing off. So hopefully that helps. But the advantage of classical is that classical listeners are used to adjusting the volume control themselves and to having the volume set much higher. So they're going to be less critical of that. I guess the one exception to that would be here in the UK, we have a radio station called Classic FM, which is pop classical, where, you know, the stuff has, people have really gone to town on the production in just the same way as they do in the pop world. And there I see stuff that's even louder than what I master. I mean, I don't think it sounds great, but that's the way that they do it. So, and especially if you're using sampled stuff where typically things will be quite compressed and processed in the creation of the sounds, you can achieve higher levels more easily than you can with a real symphony orchestra. You know, controlling the dynamics of a real recording of a symphony orchestra is quite a challenge in comparison to a lot of what we do. And he asks whether I would use the same processes for mastering orchestral music. Yes, but typically I don't use compression nearly as much. What I do lots more of when I'm mastering classical is manual changes of the level. I mean, I do this when I'm mixing and mastering pop and rock as well. Like I said, answering one of the earlier questions, I really like to do as much as I can with fader rides, or with automation curves if I'm working on a stereo file rather than a mix. But yeah, getting the right settings for compression for classical, because you've got such a wide variety of songs. You know, pop and rock track, you're probably dealing with drums, bass, guitar, vocals. Having a compression setting that works for all of those is probably fairly straightforward. For something with a much wider range of sounds in it, that can be very different.
Just a quick comment. Do you find like parallel compression usually renders up a better result for orchestral stuff?
It can do, yeah. I'm not a huge fan of parallel compression, if I'm honest, but yes, it's, you know, the nice thing.
Just to bring up the body, pretty much, not, you know, just to kind of add volume without adding gain, you know.
Yeah, although quite often for me personally, I would quite often prefer to do that with an automation lift rather than compression at all, because the risk with parallel compression is you're still using a compressor. It still has a sound to it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you set it up right, you can have it so that when the level is low, the compressor's not doing anything. So then it's just like a gain lift. But at that point, I kind of, you know, it kind of depends how complicated the material is. If you've got the early part of a movement which is low level and then it gets loud at the end, it's pretty easy to just create an automation curve that changes that relationship. So it's a bit like just riding the fader, which is how they used to do it back in the days of analog tape and, you know, all the rest of it. If you, on the other hand, if you've got a piece where it's constantly changing between very loud stuff and very quiet stuff, you could spend a long time automating the level changes in that case, and that might be a case for using some compression instead. Yeah? Is that...
Yeah. It's a good answer. Thanks.
Cool. Next, Hamid says, okay, so that's a similar question that you asked, Marco, about the differences between the mixing phase and the mastering phase. So I won't say any more on that now, but you know, with all of these questions, if you kind of come away from the call, or if people are watching it afterwards and they would have asked me something different if they were here right now, you know, fire me an email and we can follow it up. He next asks, I'm using 2 speakers and a subwoofer for mixing. Should I use a subwoofer for mastering as well? I think so. It depends what the frequency response of the monitors is. I'm not a huge fan of subwoofers in general. I prefer to have a full range monitor, but it's perfectly possible to get a great sounding setup if the sub is calibrated correctly, and that's the key. If it's calibrated correctly, you can get great results. I would try getting some test tones, running chromatic tones through, and make sure you've got a reasonably even frequency response through the sub region, through the crossover, and up to the main monitors. And if you have, then yeah, by all means, using when you're mastering. I mean, you're going to have the same challenge with all of this stuff. When, if you mix something and then you try and master it on the same set of monitors, that's a challenge, because whatever problems the monitors might have been causing, or whatever problems they were hiding when you were mixing, exactly the same thing's going to happen at mastering. One of the benefits of going to a third-party mastering engineer is you have an extra pair of ears and you have an extra pair of monitors to listen to it on. And that's why I recommend maybe getting a pair of headphones to give you an alternative perspective. But yeah, there's no problem certainly with using a sub when you're mastering. And if the speakers, for example, roll off at 70 or 80 hertz, I think then a sub is probably essential. Otherwise, you can't hear that low stuff, so you can't make a proper decision about those frequencies. We have another question here. Is delivering 24-bit at 44.1 good enough for mastering? Is using higher bit depths or sample rates valuable? It's absolutely good enough. There's probably a small benefit, as I said in answer to Don's question earlier, about for using higher sample rates like 48 kilohertz, 96, maybe not. There's no harm, but, well, actually there might be a harm. You can have some converters that won't handle high sample rate material correctly and will actually make it sound worse. I should probably give you a blog post on that. I'll post that into the window somewhere. So yeah, I won't get into a huge thing on that now, but there are cases where high sample rates would not be a good idea. There are some tests in that blog post that will help you figure out whether that applies to you. I don't see that post showing up. There it is. But yeah, 24-bit is fine. People say, should I supply 32-bit floating point or 24-bit? Doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Use dither if you're going for 24-bit. Even 16-bit. I've done loads and loads of mastering from 16-bit. If it's done well, it sounds fantastic. The only difference is the noise floor, which is typically very, very low anyway. So yeah, 24-bit is definitely good enough. Next question, he says, when you adjust a gain at the start of mastering a file, then make adjustments to EQ and compression, then decide later to increase the gain, doesn't that affect the amount of signal going into the EQ and the compression, hence changing the outcome of the sound that was set in those plugins based on the previous volume? Yes, you're absolutely right. That's why for me the mastering process is level, EQ, compression, listen and readjust the level. I think I linked you to a flow chart of my kind of process thinking about that. It is tricky and there's no way to get around it. EQ changes our perception of loudness, compression changes our perception of loudness, loudness changes our perception, level changes our perception of loudness. You change any one of those things. To give you an example, you put a song in to be mastered, you put the fader up, you get the level about right, and you think, okay, sounds pretty good, but it needs way more bass. So you add in the bass. The bass is sounding better to you, but now it sounds louder. So you turn it down a bit, and now you think, oh, well, now it sounds, maybe it needs a little bit more top because it's lost a little bit of presence, so add a little bit of top. Or you reduce a little bit out of that bass because when you've turned it down, it actually sounds a little bit bass heavy. It's a constant process of getting closer to what you want. You're kind of starts off in this kind of range, and you get it down to this kind of range, and then you get it down to this kind of range. You want to go round and round in that process of evaluating, is the level right? Is the EQ right? Are the dynamics right? Now is the level right again? And every time, hopefully, you get closer to the perfect result. Of course, using something like perception can help you find your way through that, because you're always listening at the similar volume and you're always hearing the A/B, so that the decisions get easier, and then you just choose your final level. But it's one of the challenges of mastering. It's one of the things that it makes it fascinating, I think. But it is tricky. And finally, he says, can I use reference tracks in MP3 format, or is it better to be in a WAV file format? You absolutely can use them. You know, quite often people say to me, oh, can you make this song sound like this? And I don't have it in my collection. So I head over to Spotify or Apple Music, iTunes, and listen to it. And it's a lossy encode, you know, so the quality is not fantastic. But in terms of getting an idea of the level, getting an idea of the overall EQ balance and the general sound of the song, it's absolutely fine. If you wanted to do kind of really critical listening, I would always suggest getting a WAV file. But yeah, particularly for reference tracks, I think MP3s are okay. I mean, personally, I don't like MP3s. I would recommend you use AAC, like the stuff that iTunes uses. That's much closer, I think. But modern MP3s sound a lot better than when I first formed my opinions of them. So maybe my views on MP3 are out of date these days.
Hey, Ian, I got one more question for you real quick. We're going to do a complete circle back around to the first question.
Okay.
So in the beginning, I talked about the limiter and the threshold, and then we were talking about, you said because of the 32-bit plugins that it didn't really matter if they clipped. So if we take that into consideration that it doesn't matter if those clip, what's your limit on your input gain? So let's say my final mix that I come up with is at -6 dB. Peak. Then am I only increasing my utility gain up to, let's say, I normally only go up to, let's say, plus 5 dB, which would give me 1 dB of headroom going into my next plugin. Then that way I could take my next plugin, which would be the EQ. I would do whatever changes there. If I seen the gain, if I seen the clip light come on, then I would turn the output down, you know, a half a dB or whatever to move on to the next one, or maybe a full dB, depending on how much it was doing. So I mean, is that pretty much your technique as well, or you're just basically making up that gain in the beginning? So if you're 6 dB away, then you're only increasing 6 dB or 5 dB or whatever the case may be. Because I mean, I guess basically what the issue is, or I guess how I'm understanding it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're basically using the utility gain to boost the apparent volume, and that's keeping your dynamics in the song, which at the end, which is your limiter, you're not having to limit as much, which is not tearing the dynamics of the song apart. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yeah.
And so then basically you're just basically using, because you have 6 dB of headroom, you're using 5 dB of headroom to get that volume back to where you have to use less compression at the end to get to the overall volume, or to your overall, you know, wanted RMS level of, let's say, -10. That's pretty much the theory of how I kind of, that's how I grasp it. I mean, if that's right, then
that's pretty much it, except I really don't worry about the peak, because I don't use any plugins that will distort if it goes above 0. So if it's peaking at -6 and I feel it needs to be 8 dBs louder, I will just turn it up by 8 dBs. So it'll be peaking at +2, going into whatever processing follows, and then it might have more peak levels, but then it gets to the end and the limiter deals with those peaks, and it's only going to have 2 dBs of gain reduction because it's only went 2 dBs over.
right.
And it sounds great. So one thing I should say is you don't have to do it this way. If you're more comfortable adjusting the level at the final, if you want to have a threshold of -6 in your final limiter, so you're basically adding 6 dBs at the limiter, you can do that if that seems more intuitive to you. In that case, you're going to need lower thresholds on the processing earlier on in the chain because the signal going into them is going to be lower.
Right.
But that's fine. You could do that. So you could stick with your not clipping kind of mindset, which I think is quite healthy, if I'm honest, all the way through. And then you just add that step up of gain into the limiter at the final stage. And you'll have to figure out for yourself roughly where those thresholds are. I mean, it varies though, because like, for example, I was playing around with the Fab Filter multiband just recently, and to get things feeling right to me, I think I had thresholds in the multiband there of -12, not -16. You know, it all depends on exactly how the plugins that you're using work.
Right.
But to maybe try and clarify it, imagine I have a song and I master it. If the song is sitting there and I kind of think, oh, it needs some bass, and now it needs a little bit of compression, and now it needs a bit of 2K, and now I want to turn it up by 6 dBs. As soon as I turn it up by 6 dBs, all of those judgments I made at listening to it quieter are probably wrong.
Right.
Because when you turn it up, our ear hears it differently. We hear more bass and treble. I probably change my opinion of how it sounds. Whereas if I turn it up first, then add the compression and EQ, they will change the level a little bit, but a lot less than that 6 dB change would have done if I did it afterwards.
Right.
And that's why I suggest doing it first. Now, you don't have to make that change at the beginning of the chain. You could instead the first thing you do is pull the threshold on the limiter down by 6 dBs, and then make your changes. You'll have the same final result. You're just boosting the gain somewhere else in the system. It's just, for me, it's more intuitive, and when I'm teaching it, to kind of do gain first, right at the beginning of the chain, EQ next, then compression, and don't worry about the gain at the limiter. The other nice thing about working that way is if I just push the gain up by 6 dBs and the track sounds great, I'm done. I don't need any extra processing. Excuse me, if I push the level up and it just needs a little bit of EQ and it sounds great, then I'm done. You know, I don't need any compression. So it encourages me to be minimalist.
Right.
Whereas you dive in straight away with the other processing, it's somehow you're less likely to turn that processing off again later.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. You know, I mean, your process has definitely worked for me. I feel like you know, you get to a point in anything where you get to a wall and then you kind of have to struggle to get over that wall. And I think, you know, just after the first week, I felt like, you know, I made a big hurdle, and now it's just, you know, constantly going forward. So the process works for me. It's just, you know, I was just kind of unclear on how much gain you're actually trying to get in the beginning. And it's fine because I'm not too, like I told my friend earlier, I said, you know, if I mastered every single track that I was going to do, and every single track was mastered at, let's say, -12 RMS, but it sounded clear and clean and beautiful at the end, I don't care. I don't care about it being loud. If it's not loud enough for you, buy a louder system. I mean, you know, get something that can get it loud. But I mean, at -12 RMS, it's pretty much going to be standard across the board. You're going to be pretty much in the ballpark, unless, like you say, you're listening to Skrillex, or you're listening to, you know, to some other type of, you know, dubstep or hip hop or something like that. And even in hip hop, some of their stuff is, you know, -10 RMS. You know, on the higher stuff, -9, maybe -8. But most of the time, you're relatively right with the 11 to 10.
Remember, that's using the logic meter, which is 3 dBs too quiet.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, I mean, I looked at that meter, and I looked at another meter, and that's showing on my end with I used the SSL Duro meter, and it showed my RMS on there at -11 as well. So, I mean, I'm pretty, and I even went side by side comparison it with two or three other industry standard songs that were both mastered somewhere around -11 and -10, and they were all right there in the ballpark.
It doesn't really matter if you're because you're just comparing, right? You're doing the right thing, which is you're taking a reference track and saying here's something that I'm kind of interested in emulating.
Right.
You just have to match it. It doesn't really matter what the actual numbers are. I
Yeah.
think the durometer should be correct from memory. So maybe they've updated the logic meter and it, you know, it's working correctly now.
Yeah, I'm using Logic Pro X too, so I mean, I know Logic, you know, the Pro X version. Maybe they updated that now, so
Yeah.
I haven't done that.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, it's great that it's working for you. You know, and it's probably just practice from here on in. And if you look into that EQ balancing stuff that we were talking about, I think that's gonna. The more you think about that, that's going to help as well. So yeah, I just wanted to make you aware that if you are more comfortable boosting the level at the limiter, it's absolutely fine to do it that way. It's just, for me, it's more intuitive. I think it goes right back to the first ever piece of gear that I used in mastering, which was an Aphex Dominator, which was it was a live sound broadcast thing, I think, but that was a multi-band limiter, but it was analog.
Right.
And it had a fixed output ceiling, and you just pushed up the input gain. And you know, that's kind of, that always is in the back of my mind. It's just the way that first thing you do, set the gain, and then move through the process. So yeah, well, you know, see how you go with the rest of the course, and let me know, you know, how it works. And the same for anybody watching this. You know, please do come back to me with more feedback and questions. If there's something here you want me to go into more depth on, or it didn't quite make sense to you, let me know, and I'll be happy to follow up in a later call. So, does anybody have any other questions just before we sign off? Let me check back to I don't see anything in the event. Yeah, Don mentions that IK Multimedia make a thing called ARC, which is a system that analyzes the frequency response in your room and then applies an EQ curve to try and get you closer to a flat frequency response. I've never tried a system like that. I feel more comfortable trying to get it right with the monitors and acoustic treatment and stuff, but I have heard various people say that that's been valuable for them. So that could well be worth people looking into. And there's also Sonar Works, I think, which does it for headphones, which could be an interesting thing for people to look into. So, good. I think we covered all the questions, got lots of good information out there. Thank you guys for showing up to the call.
Real quick question. Yeah. In the first welcoming series that you did, you said something about the TTL dynamic range meter, that you have an alternative coming up in a few weeks time. So I just wanted to know if anything updated on that, because I'm trying to find an alternative to TTA. I don't want to you said all the issues with it. So do you have any input on that?
We're almost there. In fact, this evening, the developer sent me a new beta version which has the final interface built in. That's what we've been. The plugin is all working and ready to go. We need to sort the interface out so that it looks nice. So I'm going to be testing that, not tonight now, but soon. If that's good, then I will hopefully launch it for you guys to bribe, the pre-release members of the course in a week or two. That's my goal. I was hoping to have it available by now, but we've just been held up a bit by some last-minute changes. So yeah, hopefully not long is the answer to that.
All right.
I hope you can bear to wait a little bit longer. Sorry it's not quite ready yet, but it's always the way with software development. It never
of course.
goes as quick as you like. And yeah, I do think there are enough problems now with the GT meter that it's probably not right that I should be recommending it anymore on the course. Because it's only 32-bit and all of those other things. So yeah, fingers crossed. I'll keep you posted.
All right. Cheers.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you guys. Thank you everybody who's watching this afterwards. I hope you enjoyed this. This is the first one of these I've done live, and it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking to people who are on the course. It's great to get feedback. Know that it's basically working for you guys, and to know maybe where there are places where some more detail is needed. So thanks very much for watching, and I will speak to you soon. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Cheers, yeah.
I appreciate it, man.